Welcome back to the Decarb Connect podcast. So this week we're going to focus on a different part of the decarbonisation issue or ecosystem, and I'm just very pleased to welcome Jaeson Cardiff, who's the founder and CEO of CleanO2 capture technologies. And what we're going to talk about today is microscale carbon capture, which is obviously very different from the sorts of discussions we often have on our particular podcast. But I really felt that Jaeson's story, but also the way that he thinks about decarbonisation as an issue had a lot of merit for the listeners of our podcast. So Jaeson, welcome. And I've already given you way more of an intro than I normally do because I'm a notoriously lazy podcast host, but perhaps you could step in and talk a little about how you've arrived at this moment in time, both your personal route and also how CleanO2 was born.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Alex. That was a wonderful introduction. Thank you. So I started off in the career of commercial plumbing and heating. I spent a tremendous amount of time in mechanical rooms looking after natural gas fired heating appliances. And in 2005, there was a lot of discussions that seemed to be seeping into the various media outlets that were looking at ways to decarbonize our energy infrastructure. And what I found interesting about those discussions was that there didn't seem to be any focus on the heating industry. All of the discussions around decarbonization were focused on transportation and energy production rather than distributed energy platforms like heating. So I thought from a career standpoint, I should probably familiarize myself with this because it seemed to be that that's where the world was heading. And in 2005, there didn't seem to be a lot of resources available for guys like me that wanted to learn more about decarbonization and how we could get involved and what we needed to be prepared for. And even when I asked manufacturers that I had connections with to see, where they were pointing the ship, they sort of indicated that their direction was largely focused on maximizing these energy efficiency components for heating, which is important. I think we should all be very efficient and as efficient as we possibly can, but there was no mention of carbon capture. So I thought, well, that's interesting. And so I just thought, well, maybe I can pitch in and try to create a solution. I've always been interested in both the environment as well as in innovation. So, over the course of the last 17 years, I have surrounded myself with some incredibly talented people who have been able to answer that question of how we can address carbon emissions from the heating industry by creating a technology that can easily bolt into an existing mechanical room. It can be retrofit into a heating platform, and it can convert carbon emissions into a chemical commodity that is used in multiple industries. And that industry can then engage people with these products. For example, we make a lot of soap and detergent and personal care products from these recycled carbon. And it's amazing how you can engage people to have discussions around climate change, energy efficiencies, all sorts of important topics with a bar of soap. So we've really sort of helped move the dial, and I think in some way have reframed what we think the future of the heating industry can look like.
So out of interest, were you someone who had a kind of an entrepreneurial drive before that, or was this just one of those happy moments of you see the issue, it's a moment in time where environment is more and more on the agenda, or what's the reality for you, would you say?
I've always been interested in innovation and not so much business ownership. I took a lot of inspiration from my dad. My dad was always in the garage, working on things, solving problems, fixing things. And I always thought that was a very fascinating ability. I admire him for that, still admire him for that. He's quite an innovator himself. But the creation of this business was more or less just trying to solve a problem rather than trying to create a business. It was the business was as a result of recognizing that in order to solve the problem, you have to have a business to support the deployment of the technology rather than wanting to start a business based on the technology itself. So yeah, but I've always been more focused on innovation than business ownership. But I don't know. I think we're doing okay.
You definitely seem to be. So that actually segues quite nicely into sort of, before we talk more about what microscale CCUS actually means and give it some context, just give an outline of CleanO2. So what's the business model and the kind of the market that you're playing into, and where are you at? You've obviously, you mentioned you've been in kind of a 17-year development phase, but clearly things have kicked up a notch in the last couple of years. So perhaps you can set the scene.
Sure. So when we talk about microscale carbon capture, we're talking about the micro sources of GHGs. We're talking about hot water tanks and boilers. We're talking about commercial properties, residential properties. We're talking about very small points of source production of greenhouse gases. So the value that we bring to our customer is we provide them with the technology that converts their flue gases into a commodity that can be sold. And when we sell that commodity, we profit share with our customer to hasten the return on the investment. So the analogy that we like to use on a regular basis is we call it urban mining. So we go into this joint partnership with our customers where we mine their flue gas, preventing the carbon dioxide from entering the atmosphere, converting it into a product, selling the product, and then we share with them that some of that revenue to get the return on the investment. But it's more than just that as well. We also we're listed as an economizer, so we actually reduce the amount of natural gas that building is using because we're reclaiming some of that waste heat and plugging that back into the building. And in the commercial heating space, preventative maintenance is key to a healthy building. If you have a building that doesn't have some sort of proactive measure in terms of ongoing maintenance, then you're probably paying more to keep your building running than you should. So we provide that service at no charge to our customer to make sure that their systems are running properly so they can be more proactive instead of reactive. And where things get really interesting for us is we have some of our customers, for example, I have a hotel. So in the case of a hotel, we can convert flue gases from their domestic hot water heating platform, convert it into, say, laundry detergent, and then bring that laundry detergent back to the building to use to wash their linens. Obviously, they go through a tremendous amount of hot water. They go through a tremendous amount of laundry detergent and other cleaning goods. So we are not only helping support greenhouse gas emission reductions, we're also helping support the circular economy, where we're capturing something that would otherwise have been vented to atmosphere, turning it into a usable good, and then using that back on site. And we get asked all of the time, it's quite common when people say, well, after you use the soap, does the CO2 not get vented back into atmosphere? The answer is no, that carbon is permanently sequestered as a carbonate. It goes into solution, and if the water evaporates, it precipitates back out as a carbonate. It is not re-released.
And in terms of where you're at as a business, what's the kind of scale of the business? You mentioned hotels as one of the kind of markets you play into. What's the client base?
Our most recent addition is a project that we just announced with the U.S. Department of Defense, the Navy, in a project that should be up and running in the next few months. We work with commercial property owners. We work with aggregated residential owners like condominium complexes. We work with rec centers. We work with malls. We're talking about possibly doing a project with a hospital. So that's kind of the scope and scale of properties that we work with.
So when you think about the US Navy and hospitals and hotels, just to really kind of bring it down to the nuts and bolts, what are the factors that mean those customers can leverage the strengths of CleanO2?
So first, we look for centralized heating platforms in these buildings. So if they have a boiler or a hot water tank, then we look at the size of the boiler. We're not an industrial player, although we do get asked on a regular basis if we can play in that space. And I always say it's like asking Fiat to go build a cargo ship. I'm sure they could build a wonderful cargo ship, but that's not really in their wheelhouse. So we're sort of the same. We're really focused on those microscale sources of GHGs. So we typically look at boilers that range anywhere from 250,000 BTUs up to 1.5 million BTUs. We've got a little bit higher in some instances, but that's kind of the range that we typically look at.
Okay, now again, you said, it's been this 17-year journey, and obviously, with the kind of contracts you're talking about, you're now at kind of really interesting inflection point. When you think back over the last few years, what have been the main drivers or the points in time that have sort of, I don't know, unleashed your next round of potential? What have been those points along the route?
Pivots, yes, we've had a few along the way. So originally the business model was this arbitrage play of commodities. So we thought, okay, well, we spent over 10 years developing this technology. I guess it was probably closer to 12 years by the time we had something really, really usable before we even started with the business model. So then we started developing a business model. And we thought, okay, well, look, we're going to plug in this lower cost commodity into our unit. We're going to pull it out, and then we're just going to sell that to the end user. The large scale fertilizer producers, or the textile industry, or the soap and detergent industry, because they're going to want to buy this because it's green. And then we're going to sail off into the sunset together and come away a winner. And what we found was not taking into account volumes. Volumes matter. So if you have this little tiny source of GHGs, you're not going to produce massive quantities of carbonates. But that's what they use. So when we went to these industries and we said, hey, we've got this green carbonate that we've produced, they sort of looked at us and say, nice, how cute, call us back when you've got larger volumes. So we thought, okay, well, that's clearly a problem, because it's going to take us a while to get to scale. So that was a problem. So we thought, okay, well, first and foremost, what do we need to do? Well, we need to engage people to have them better understand what it is that we're trying to do. How do we do that? Well, let's create some marketing tools. Well, what is carbonate used in? Well, they use it in bar soap. Well, why don't we make some bar soap? So my wife and I went to YouTube University and learned how cold processed soaps were made. And we made a few batches, and we shared them with some of our project partners, the gas utilities that we're working with, and they loved it. And but I was very clear. I was adamant that it was only a marketing tool, and it was just meant for show, and we would never sell soap. This was just a silly thing. We were never going to sell soap. And I was vocal to everybody. And well, here we are now, 17 years later, and we have the capacity of doing over 100,000 units of soap per month. And clearly we're making soap. So I think that was probably the biggest pivot point for us, is recognizing an opportunity within our marketplace to say, well, if the leaders of these industries don't get what we're trying to do, we have to become the leaders ourselves to pave the path to show them. And then eventually, once we've shown sufficient value, we've shown sufficient traction, then we can go back to those other industry leaders and say, look, we've done it. Here's the numbers. It works. Now you can run with it. It's yours. Here. Merry Christmas. There's been other pivots along the way. Like, for example, the early technology that we worked with was an aqueous processing system. We realized that there's a certain amount of hazards associated with aqueous processors. We start off with a caustic material, and if I spill dry caustic on the floor of a mechanical room, yes, that's bad, but we can clean it up fairly quickly, and there's very minimal risk to person and property. If it's an aqueous processing system and we spill liquid caustic all over the floor, well, now we've damaged the floor. There's no 5-second rule. You've damaged the floor, or worse, you've hurt somebody. So we sort of said, okay, well, we need to address that, because safety is key, absolutely key. We're not going to get very far if we're hurting people or damaging property. So we moved over to an anhydrous or a dry pack chemical processor, so we can really sort of focus on safety procedures and make sure that we're operating properly. But yeah, that's kind of the general sort of pivots and moments, aha moments, where we said, oh, we need to alter course.
And then before I sort of ask you a broader question about heating and decarbonisation of heating, just give us the sense of the team. Like, what's the size of the team that you have at the moment? I know later in the conversation we're going to talk about perhaps what's next, but what's the scale right now?
We're 23 staff, and we're spread pretty thin because we are scaling, as we are operating in 3 different countries. Looking to come to the UK next year. We've got a number of interested parties that are trying to open the door for us to get us over into that neck of the woods, which is very exciting because of the huge efforts to decarbonize the heating industry. So I suspect if you asked me in another 6 months, that number would be very different.
Okay, well, we'll talk a little bit more about those kind of growth plans towards the end. But when you and I met and sort of had a chat about this episode, one of the things that you, I guess, were kind of quite, you did stress with me is that you understand, or that you're definitely very well aware that you're one element of the wider challenge of how do we decarbonize heat. So let's take a look at that macro view, because I think you have a really interesting perspective on it, given your original background as well as this scale up that you're developing now. What is your perspective on what is it going to take to decarbonize the heating industry quite widely? And then we'll maybe have a look specifically at buildings and things like that. But what's your perspective on that?
Well, education is really key here. I think in the media, when we talk about decarbonization, specifically in the heating industry, we tend to look at this point sources of GHGs. We look at the boilers, and we look at the gas water heaters, and we look at all of those products that are generating the GHGs. But almost never do I hear anybody talking about the envelope of the building that they're in. And really, at the end of the day, if you're not willing to look at the building holistically, look at the thing that's generating the GHGs, but then also look at the envelope. Do you have a 2x4 exterior stud wall? Do you have leaky windows? Do you have poor insulation in your attic? If the envelope is not high efficiency, then it really doesn't matter what you're putting in as your heat source as much, because you're having to expend so much energy to keep that building warm during the winter months that you've kind of missed the point. So I think one of the things that we all need to be aware of is to educate ourselves on what does it mean holistically to decarbonize these platforms, specifically in the retrofit industry. You look at buildings like, say, the Empire State Building. How do you make it net zero? How do you do that? You can't change the exterior very well or very inexpensively. It's an expensive thing. I think that's probably the main reason why we tend to look at the boilers or the things that are generating heat, because that's kind of on the low end of costs to the consumer, is to get that thing upgraded. When you start talking about altering the envelope of the building, especially in a commercial building, that's a big touch. That's a lot of cash that needs to be spent. And who's going to spend that? I mean, there are government incentives to certainly help with that, but the owner of the building has to bear the brunt of that. So yeah, ultimately, at the end of the day, it's just a case of really just educating people and understanding what does it mean to decarbonize the heating industry. Another great example would be to look at the terms that we use. And I'll give you an example. There are a lot of people out there that still have a mid-efficient gas-fired appliance. So they have to upgrade it to a high-efficiency appliance. The word mid versus the word high indicate that there's a spread between the two. There's like a 50-50 split, right? Mid is in the middle, high efficiency is on the top end. But in reality, a mid-efficient boiler or a hot water tank is like 85 to 87% efficient. When you go to a high efficiency appliance, on average, it's 95% efficient. So you're only getting anywhere from 7 to 10% increases in efficiency. But when you compare that to the amount of money that you have to spend to get that extra 10%, it's sizable. It's really sizable. So I think it's also important to understand, again, educate yourself in terms of what does it mean to increase the efficiency of not just the heat platform, but the building as a whole.
The building is a system. I think we've had people on the podcast before that have talked about the need for, whether it's investors or technology companies or industrials, which is what we're normally talking about here, to think systemically, not just about this kind of, I've narrowed in on this one thing, we can now fix this one thing. So it's that systemic thinking that's really
exactly
needed. Well, coming back to the carbon capture story and reuse, one of the things that's sort of interesting about it, and I can sometimes forget this because I'm so immersed in these sorts of conversations, it's like every now and again I'm sort of slightly baffled by why it might be that in the real world, in the outer world, there's not a huge amount of buy-in to carbon capture on all continents, and there is something of a struggle to bring the kind of the public into this into the reasons why we should invest in this stuff. So I'm just interested again in your perspective of this. You talked a little bit about story, and the very title of this session is kind of designed to look at how micro scale carbon capture can be a real help to the wider story of CCS. Just talk to me about that a little bit.
Yeah, it's funny. I had this conversation a couple of days ago with some good friends of ours that are working in the energy space, and I've heard this from other people that are in the industry, and that is that the energy industry sucks at storytelling. They're horrible at it, and it's hard. It's hard to do. How do you make energy? How do you make carbon capture? How do you make things like efficiency attractive to talk about? And it's a difficult thing to do, because people will talk about their electric car, or they'll talk about PV, or they'll talk about the wind station, because it's a big visual and it's different. So it's something that's easily digestible and it's in your face and you can talk about it. But when we talk about energy and we talk about carbon capture, these almost feel like somewhat abstract, and so it's kind of hard, I think, to engage people. So then I think that's where we can help, and it's not just help our own company, but help the carbon capture industry as a whole by creating tangible goods. Like if I'm at a party and I want to talk about carbon capture, and I can have it relate to the clothes that I'm wearing, or the bar soap in my bathroom, or the fertilizer that I used on my lawn because my lawn is lush and green. Well, those are tangible things that people can get, and it allows them to find a channel to pursue, to have those discussions and to tell those stories. So I think the carbon capture industry and the energy industry as a whole needs to find more tangible avenues to present to the public so that they can get engaged, because what they're doing right now is not very usable. So I'm hoping, at some level, that the CleanO2 can help in that narrative and help break it down so that more people can talk about this very important matter, which is climate change and carbon efficient, or carbon management and carbon reduction and energy efficiencies and all of those things, energy literacy, all of those things are very, very important. So if we can help in some way to play a part, I think that'd be pretty cool. Yeah,
I wonder if sometimes that piece on kind of carbon literacy and people being able to really envisage what these technologies are doing, it's almost because I guess like any early sectors, often the technology is sold by the engineers that built it. And no, obviously we need those engineers, but that's not necessarily where the natural storytelling capability comes from. And I think your point about, I get that you do now have soap as a key part of the business, but originally it was a device. It was a narrative device. And I think there's something really powerful in that, like being able to physically touch something that is part of energy transition and decarbonisation. I think that's going to be important for most populations to really get behind the sort of incentives and, I don't know, other things we're going to have to do to make it real. Yeah, and I think, in 20 years, I think carbon capture will be just one of those things we take for granted. It'll be like the internet. There was a time when the internet was a new thing, and there were many people that thought it would be a fad and would never go anywhere. And yet here we are, you and I, talking, thousands of miles apart from each other, as though it's just an everyday thing, right? It's a normal thing. I think carbon capture will be viewed as the same thing. It's just an integral part of our society to try to undo, the decades and years of maybe some mismanagement in terms of how much emissions we're pumping into our atmosphere. Let's kind of close out then with a look at what's next for you as a business. So you've sort of alluded to the possibility, the opportunity of expanding into new markets. What's coming next? And I mean, we do have often on these episodes, we're talking about people who are in financing rounds. Is that part of your field of vision at the moment or not? So maybe you can talk to us about that. Yeah, well, from an expansion standpoint, as I said, we are currently expanding our reach in both Canada, the United States, and Japan. We have project partners in the UK and EU and Australia that we're hoping to expand out into in 2023. Our goal from a tech standpoint, we've been able to hit an independent mark of carbon reduction per mechanical room in around 20 to 30%.
We have a new version that we're hoping to have out in Q1 next year that should be able to get to 50%. Long-term, 3 to 4 years, we have another technology that we're currently developing that'll get us to 100%. Our goal has always been to decarbonize this industry, and we have a roadmap to get there. So, I think the face of CleanO2 is obviously going to be very different in another 2-3 years. I'm looking forward to it. In terms of investment, we're launching a Series A, I think here Q1 of next year to help support the rapid deployment of these technologies, help us work with international manufacturing agencies to be helped to deploy. We're also working on a regional business model. We want to help support job growth opportunities in the various regions that we're operating in, not just decarbonization, not just circular economy, but local economic growth as well. And those things take money and they take time. So that's largely what our Series A will be used towards is further projects abroad.
Well, really, just great to talk to you, Jaeson. I know people that put up with me on this podcast regularly will know that it's often the stories from the founders, the creators of new technology like you that I get really excited about, because partly it's just fascinating to hear where these come from, but it's also just hugely hopeful to me to see how these a technology such as yours can really come to scale and have this incredible impact. So thank you for coming on. It's been great to talk with you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Many thanks for listening to the Decarb Connect podcast. We work with clients across the industrial sectors, specifically those who are tasked with decarbonising the most energy-intensive products and materials that we use every day. If you have an interest in learning more about either our members network, our reports, or our event series, do get in touch with us at decarbconnect.com. Or if you'd like to take part in the podcast, email me, Alex, at ac@decarbconnect.com. Thanks for listening.